June 10, 1963, 9 p.m. Smalls Paradise, 2294 7th Avenue. Bumpy Johnson had been locked in Alcatraz for 11 years. Tonight was his first night home. 300 people packed the basement club. Champagne flowed. Jazz roared. But Bumpy wasn't celebrating. He was watching a skinny kid from North Carolina who shouldn't have been there. The kid's name was Frank Lucas. 23 years old. Switchblade in his pocket. Ambition in his eyes. He'd talked his way past Bumpy's enforcers. Past the velvet rope. Past every barrier designed to keep nobodies out. Bumpy studied him from table 7. The center booth. The power seat. 11 years in Alcatraz taught you to read men fast. This kid was different. Hungry. Dangerous. Smart enough to be lethal. Neither man knew this meeting would kill Harlem. Neither understood they were shaking hands with history. The old guard meeting the future. A philosopher meeting the businessman. In 5 years, Bumpy would be dead. In 7, Frank would control a heroin empire worth $52 million. But tonight, in Smalls Paradise, with Billie Holiday's voice echoing off brick walls, they were just 2 men. 1 kingdom. 1 crown. Only one would wear it. 11 years and 2 months earlier, federal agents had dragged Bumpy Johnson into court. Ellsworth Raymond, Bumpy. Johnson wasn't your typical gangster. He'd controlled Harlem for 3 decades without permission from the Italian families. Ran numbers, policy banks, protection rackets. But he also read Shakespeare between hits. Quoted Marcus Garvey at strategy meetings. Wore 3 peace suits to funerals and fedoras to fights. The bump on his skull gave him his name. His mind gave him his power. He'd survived Dutch Schultz, Lucky Luciano, and Thomas Dewey's crusade. 57 years old in 1963, he'd spent more time in prison than most men spent working. But every time he came out, Harlem welcomed him home like a king returning from war. Alcatraz changed men, broke them. The Rock sat in San Francisco Bay like a tomb. Freezing water, brutal guards, isolation that ate your mind. Bumpy had gone in at 52, came out at 63, gray hair, deep lines. Hands that shook when he thought no one was watching. But his eyes stayed sharp. His network stayed loyal. His reputation stayed intact. June 1963 was chaos in Harlem. The civil rights movement was exploding. Malcolm X preached at the corner of Lenox and 135th. The Italians were flooding the streets with heroin, garbage dope, 3% pure. White cops were cracking skulls at protests. Black kids were dying in alleys. The neighborhood Bumpy left in 1952 had transformed. More desperate, more violent. More hungry for something that looked like power. Every gangster in New York was watching. Would Bumpy reclaim his throne? Could an old man in a young man's game survive? The Genovese family sent scouts. The numbers runners held their breath. Smalls Paradise became the stage. That first night home would set the tone. Frank Lucas wasn't supposed to exist. Born September 9, 1930. In LaGrange, North Carolina, dirt poor, watched the Ku Klux Klan murder his cousin when he was 6, saw them tie Obadiah to a post, shove a shotgun in his mouth, pull the trigger. That image burned into Frank's brain. Taught him the world had no rules. Only winners and losers, survivors and corpses. He'd arrived in Harlem in 1946, 16 years old, $500 in his pocket, no connections. No family, just raw ambition and a willingness to do what others wouldn't. For 17 years, he'd worked the streets. Muscle for small-time dealers. Enforcer for policy runners. Learning, watching, waiting. Frank understood something other hustlers didn't. The game was changing. The old gangsters, Bumpy's generation, ran Harlem like a government. Codes, honor, community respect. But Frank saw weakness in that philosophy. Honor didn't pay bills. Respect didn't build empires. The Italians controlled heroin because they ignored the old rules. They treated drugs like a business. Supply and demand. Profit margins. Frank wanted to be Italian without being Italian. Black, independent, ruthless. By 1963, Frank had killed 3 men. Nobody could prove it, but the streets knew. Tango, a 270-pound dealer who disrespected him, shot 4 times on 125th Street in broad daylight. A policy runner who stole from him, found in the Hudson with concrete boots. A cop who demanded too much, car bomb outside a precinct. Frank's body count was small, but his methods were surgical. No witnesses, no evidence, no fear. He'd heard Bumpy was coming home. Saw opportunity in the old man's return. If Bumpy reclaimed power, Frank wanted to be close, learn from the master. If Bumpy was too old, too tired, too broken, Frank would take the throne himself. Tonight was the audition. Frank hadn't been invited to Small's Paradise, but he'd come anyway. Small's Paradise was the only nightclub in Harlem owned by a black man. Ed Smalls had opened it in 1925 during the Renaissance. The club sat in a basement at 2294 7th Avenue between 134th and 135th. You walked down 15 steps into another world. Red leather booths lined brick walls. A mahogany bar stretched 40 feet. A stage in the corner where Billie Holiday once sang for tips. The ceiling dripped with cigarette smoke and possibility. Smalls had a rule: no guns, no fights, no disrespect. Break the rule once, you were banned for life. Break it twice, you disappeared. June 10th, 1963. The club opened at 7 p.m. By 8 p.m., every seat was filled. Bumpy's homecoming wasn't advertised, but Harlem knew. Word traveled through barber shops, beauty salons, policy offices. The king had returned. By 9 p.m., 300 people packed the basement. Musicians, gangsters, politicians, hustlers, ladies in evening gowns, men in zoot suits, everyone who mattered, and everyone who wanted to matter. The air smelled like perfume, bourbon, and fried chicken from the kitchen. A jazz quartet played, saxophone, piano, bass, drums. The sound bounced off brick, creating a wall of rhythm. Laughter, conversation, the clink of glasses. Harlem at its finest, compressed into one room. Bumpy sat at table 7, the center of the room, flanked by 6 men, his inner circle. Junie Bird, his childhood friend. Nat Pettigrew, his enforcer. 4 others whose names stayed whispered. Bumpy wore a gray suit, white shirt, no tie. His hands rested on the table. No drink, no food, just watching, reading the room like a book. At 9:17 p.m., Frank Lucas walked through the door. He wore a cheap suit, brown, off the rack. His shoes needed polish. His tie was crooked. He looked like a nobody. That was intentional. Frank understood camouflage. 2 of Bumpy's men moved to intercept him at the stairs. Frank didn't flinch, spoke quietly, mentioned a name, someone from North Carolina Bumpy knew. A cousin, a connection, thin but real. The enforcers hesitated, let him pass. Frank walked through the crowd. Straight line, no deviation. Heads turned. Who was this kid? Why was he heading toward Bumpy's table? Conversations paused. The saxophone player hit a wrong note. The room's energy shifted. Tension replaced celebration. At 9:19 p.m., Frank stopped 3 feet from table 7. Bumpy looked up, didn't speak, just stared. His face showed nothing. No anger, no curiosity, nothing. The 6 men around him tensed. Hands moved toward pockets, toward weapons. Frank kept his hands visible, open palms. A show of respect or surrender, or both. Mr. Johnson, Frank said. His voice was soft, southern accent still clinging to consonants. I'm Frank Lucas, from LaGrange. I knew your cousin Jasper. Bumpy didn't blink, didn't move. 5 seconds passed. 10. The silence stretched like piano wire. The entire club was watching now. Music stopped. Conversations died. 300 people held their breath. At 9:20 p.m., Bumpy smiled. Not a warm smile, not friendly. A predator recognizing another predator. Sit down. Bumpy said. What Frank didn't know was that Bumpy had been expecting him. 3 days earlier, on June 7th, while still in transit from Alcatraz, Bumpy received a letter, hand-delivered by a guard he'd paid off years ago. The letter came from Nat Pettigrew, his enforcer. It contained 12 names, men who'd grown powerful while Bumpy was locked away, men who might challenge him, men to watch. Frank Lucas was number 7. Nat's intelligence was thorough. Frank's kills, his ambition, his philosophy, most importantly, his weakness, impatience. Frank wanted power now. Couldn't wait. Couldn't play the long game. That made him dangerous and predictable. Bumpy had spent 2 days planning this moment. He knew Frank would crash the homecoming party. Knew Frank needed to make a statement. So Bumpy turned it into a test. Told his enforcers to let Frank through if he used the North Carolina connection. Wanted to see if Frank had done his homework. If he understood respect, even fake respect. Frank passed the first test. Now came the second. You want something? Bumpy said. Not a question. A fact. His voice carried across the silent room. You didn't crash my party to say hello. Frank nodded. I want to work for you. Why? Because you're the smartest man in Harlem. And I'm tired of working for dumb people. The room waited. Bumpy's men looked ready to beat Frank unconscious. But Bumpy laughed, a real laugh, deep, genuine. He reached into his jacket. Every gun in the room came halfway out of every holster. Bumpy pulled out a photograph, placed it on the table, slid it toward Frank. The photo showed Frank Lucas standing outside a warehouse on 141st Street. 3 weeks ago, talking to a known heroin dealer. The picture was grainy but clear. Unmistakable. You want to work for me, Bumpy said. But you're already working for the Italians' competition, to building your own thing, planning your own move. He leaned forward, his eyes locked onto Frank's. You didn't come here for a job, son. You came here to see if I was finished, to measure me, to decide if you should wait for me to die or help me along. Frank's face stayed neutral, but his jaw tightened. Bumpy saw it. Everyone saw it. Here's what you don't understand, Bumpy continued. Power isn't about being the toughest. It's about being inevitable. You can beat me. Maybe? You're younger, hungrier. But you'll never be me, because you don't have a code, and men without codes die alone. Bumpy stood up, 6'8" of presence in a 5'8" frame. He placed a hand on Frank's shoulder, not aggressive, almost fatherly. I'm going to teach you something, Frank Lucas. How to build a kingdom that lasts. But first, you're going to work for me. Really work. 5 years, maybe 10. You're going to learn patience. And if you survive, if you don't let your ambition kill you first, then maybe you'll deserve what you want. Frank stared at Bumpy, then nodded. Yes, sir. Good. Now get out of my party. Come see me Monday, 116th Street, 9 a.m. Don't be late. Frank turned, walked back through the crowd. The room exhaled. At 9:27 p.m., the music started again. The party resumed. But everything had changed. Frank Lucas left Small's Paradise and walked 20 blocks in the rain. He didn't feel defeated. He felt educated. Bumpy had read him like a map, seen through every move. Frank realized he'd been playing checkers while Bumpy played chess. The photograph proved it. Bumpy had been watching Frank for weeks, maybe months. Had him followed, documented, filed away as threat level manageable. The next morning, every gangster in Harlem knew about the confrontation. Stories spread through barbershops and street corners. Some said Frank had been humiliated. Others said he'd been anointed. Both were true. Bumpy had publicly claimed Frank as a protégé, but also as a subordinate. Frank was now Bumpy's problem and Bumpy's weapon. The Italian families sent word through intermediaries. Congratulations on your return, mister. Johnson, we look forward to working together. Translation, don't rock the boat. Bumpy sent word back Harlem takes care of its own. Translation, stay out. Monday morning, 9 sharp. Frank showed up at 116th Street, a row house. Unremarkable. Bumpy answered the door himself. Handed Frank a set of car keys. You're my driver now. You want to learn how I think? Sit next to me for a year. Watch. Listen. Shut up! For 5 years, Frank Lucas drove Bumpy Johnson around Harlem. Watched him negotiate with the Italians. Watched him settle disputes without violence. Watched him build networks through loyalty instead of fear. Frank learned, absorbed, waited. July 7, 1968. Bumpy Johnson collapsed at Wells Restaurant. Heart attack. Dead at 62. Frank was there, held him as he died. Bumpy's last words, stay clean. Promise me? Frank promised. Kept the promise for 11 hours. Then called Bangkok and built a heroin empire that destroyed everything Bumpy had protected. June 10, 1963, was the night Harlem signed its own death warrant. Bumpy Johnson represented the old way. Crime with codes. Power with responsibility. He kept heroin out of Harlem, or at least controlled. Kept the Italians at arm's length. Protected the neighborhood even while bleeding it. His philosophy was feudal rule through respect, maintain order, let the people prosper under your protection. Frank Lucas represented the new way, to crime as capitalism, power without sentiment. He flooded Harlem with blue magic, heroin so pure it killed, turned the neighborhood into a narcotics empire worth $52 million. Made himself rich by making his community addicted. His philosophy was Darwinian, survival of the ruthless, profit over people, power as the only currency that mattered. That night at Small's Paradise, these two philosophies met, shook hands. Bumpy thought he could civilize Frank, teach him the code, turn ambition into leadership. He failed, because Frank learned everything Bumpy taught, strategy, patience, network building, but ignored the most important lesson. Power without purpose destroys everything, including itself. Real power isn't about being feared. It's about being necessary. Bumpy understood that. Frank never did. By 1975, Frank was in prison. His empire collapsed, his family destroyed, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale. Bumpy's legacy endured. 70 years after his death, people still study him, still respect him, still understand that he represented something Harlem lost and never recovered. The day Bumpy met Frank was the day the old Harlem died. Neither man knew it. History never announces itself. It just unfolds one handshake at a time. If this story showed you why mentorship can't save a man determined to destroy himself, hit subscribe. Drop a like if you understand why Bumpy tried anyway. Comment, would YOU have taken Frank under your wing or eliminated the threat?